A clumsy, slow waitress fumbles a tea service before the most ruthless mafia boss in Seoul, and then whispers a single sentence in an archaic royal court dialect that hasn't been spoken since the fall of the Joseon dynasty. The air in the lounge turns to ice. Stone-faced bodyguards drop their hands to their sides in instinctive, ancestral terror, and Kang Moo-sok realizes too late. He didn't just insult a waitress, he just committed treason against a queen. Subscribe for realistic mafia crime stories, where power is challenged, mistakes carry consequences, and one critical detail changes everything. In the neon-soaked heights of Gangnam, Lee Wong was a ghost, a girl they called stupid because she moved too slow and looked at the floor too much. But when the syndicate's king, Kang Moo-sok, walks into the lounge to celebrate his bloody rise to power, her slow nature is revealed to be something far more dangerous: royal patience. One sharp rebuke in a forgotten tongue exposes a bloodline the world thought was extinct, turning a night of celebration into a desperate hunt through the shadows of Seoul. This is the story of the girl who wasn't hiding from the syndicate. She was the last rightful ruler, waiting to reclaim her throne. Lee Wong was a master of the clumsy apology. In the hyper-polished world of the Blue Lotus Lounge, where the air smelled of sandalwood and billionaire hubris, she was the only friction in an otherwise frictionless machine. She moved with a calculated hesitation, a fraction of a second behind the rhythm of the other staff, ensuring she remained the slow girl, the one the floor managers looked at with pitying sighs, and the one the wealthy patrons forgot before she even left their table. She smoothed her dark vest, her fingers grazing the rough skin of her palms, calluses hidden by the grace of her service, but earned through years of private, disciplined movement. To the world, she was Lee Wong, a girl from the outskirts with no pedigree and a supposedly dim mind. In reality, her every stumble was a tactical maneuver. She dropped napkins to eavesdrop on conversations about offshore accounts. She fumbled with wine buckets to linger near men discussing the restructuring of Seoul's underworld. In a city where everyone was desperate to be seen, her greatest weapon was being a nuisance they wanted to ignore. The lounge was a fortress of glass and greed, perched high above the neon arteries of Gangnam. Below, the city screamed with modern ambition, but inside the Blue Lotus, time felt heavy and artificial. Wong moved toward table 7, carrying a tray of gold-rimmed teacups. She allowed her left foot to drag slightly, a subtle mistake in her gait that signaled her approach as unthreatening. I am so sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice a practiced, breathy tremor as she placed a porcelain cup in front of a venture capitalist. She let her hand shake just enough to make the tea slosh against the rim. "Watch it, girl," the man snapped, not even looking up from his encrypted phone. "You're as slow as a turtle and twice as dim." "My deepest apologies, sir. It won't happen again," Wong replied, bowing low. As she bowed, her eyes remained sharp, scanning the documents scattered on the table, memorizing names and figures with the clarity that would have terrified the man had he noticed. She retreated into the shadows of the service station, her heart beating in a steady, slow rhythm that contradicted her nervous exterior. This was her life, a synchronized panic attack played out in slow motion. Every day was a gamble that her mask of incompetence would hold. She was the last of a bloodline that had once ruled this land from wooden palaces, and now she served the descendants of the traitors who had burned those palaces down. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. For a fleeting second, she didn't see the clumsy waitress. She saw the iron-willed woman who spent her nights practicing the ancient, silent forms of her ancestors in a cramped apartment. She was a shadow waiting for the sun to set on the men who thought they owned Seoul. She just needed to stay invisible. She just needed to be the girl who fumbled, until the moment came when she didn't have to be. But as the heavy mahogany doors of the lounge swung open and the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, Wang felt a cold shiver of recognition. The Tiger of Seoul had arrived, and the game of fumbles was about to become a matter of life and death. The entrance of Kung Musuk was not a grand spectacle. It was a clinical extraction of warmth from the room. When the heavy, brass-studded doors of the Blue Lotus swung open, the ambient hum of Gangnam's elite withered into a brittle silence. It started at the host stand and rippled through the lounge like a deepening frost, until even the ice in the crystal tumblers seemed to stop melting. Musuk walked with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a predator that had never known a cage. He was an older man, his hair silvered and swept back with surgical precision, wearing a black suit that looked less like clothing and more like armor. Behind him, 3 silhouettes trailed in a perfect, terrifying formation. At their center was Choi Min-jae, a man whose stillness was more violent than most men's actions. Min-jae's eyes didn't wander. They dissected the room, marking exits, counting waitstaff, and lingering in the shadows where Lee Wang stood. Wang felt the air grow thin. She retreated further into her slow persona, her shoulders hunching, her gaze dropping to the floor as she clutched a silver serving tray to her chest. To a casual observer, she was a rabbit sensing a wolf. In reality, she was a scholar of the old ways, recognizing the specific brand of cruelty Musuk radiated, the kind that belonged to a man who didn't just want power, but wanted the world to bleed for it. The party was seated at the center table, a circular slab of black obsidian. Musuk didn't sit so much as he occupied the space, his presence expanding until the bodyguards settled into a protective arc behind him. The other patrons, men who considered themselves the kings of industry, suddenly looked like frightened children, their eyes darting toward the exits. "The girl," Musuk's voice rasped, cutting through the silence. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. He didn't look at the manager, who was bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the carpet. He pointed a single ringed finger toward Wang. "The slow one. Let her serve the tiger's feast. I want to see if her clumsiness is as legendary as they say." The manager hissed for Wang to move. She obeyed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She approached the obsidian table, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. As she leaned in to pour the vintage tea, she let a drop, just one, splatter onto the sleeve of Musuk's pristine jacket. The room gasped. Choi Min-jae's hand twitched toward his waistband, his shadow looming over her. Wang immediately dropped to her knees, her forehead pressed against the cool floor in a frantic, desperate apology. "I am sorry. Please, great sir, my hands, they are slow. I am stupid." Musuk looked down at the dark spot on his wool sleeve, then at the trembling girl at his feet. A cruel, thin smile touched his lips. He reached out, his hand hovering over her head, not to strike, but to humiliate. "A turtle in a den of dragons," he mused, his voice dripping with modern street slang, mocking her lack of grace. "Do you even know whose blood you've spilled, you pathetic peasant?" Wang remained face down, her eyes squeezed shut. The insult to her peasant status burned hotter than any physical blow. Beneath the mask of the fumbling waitress, the royal blood in her veins began to simmer. She was a ghost of a kingdom they thought they had buried, and the tiger was currently standing on her grave. He didn't realize that even ghosts have teeth. The silence in the Blue Lotus was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum. Kang Musuk leaned back, his hand still hovering over Lee Wang's bowed head like a dark crown. He signaled to one of his men, who produced a thick stack of high-denomination won notes. With a flick of his wrist, Musuk spattered the money over Wang's back. The paper fluttered down like autumn leaves on a grave. "Buy yourself some better shoes, turtle," Musuk sneered, his voice loud enough for every cowering executive in the room to hear. In this city, speed is king, and you are just a slow, broken relic of a village that should have been paved over decades ago." He laughed, a dry, grating sound, and looked to his men for approval. Choi Min-jae didn't laugh. He remained a statue of stone, his eyes fixed on the back of Wang's neck. He saw what the others didn't, the way her trembling had stopped, the way her breathing had shifted from the ragged gasps of a victim to a deep, resonant rhythm that seemed to draw power from the very floor beneath her. Wang didn't reach for the money. She didn't stay face down. Slow and deliberate, she rose, her spine straightened with a terrifying grace, each vertebrae clicking into place until she stood taller than any waitress had a right to stand. The fumbling girl vanished. In her place was a woman whose presence felt as heavy as a palace wall. She didn't look at the money on the floor. She looked directly into Musuk's eyes, a feat of such profound defiance that the air in the lounge seemed to shatter. When she spoke, the voice that emerged was not the breathy stammer of Li Wang. It was a cold, melodic resonance, utilizing a syntax so formal and an accent so ancient that it felt like a ghost had entered the room. It was the Gungjung-o, the forbidden court dialect of the great king's inner circle. Small men often mistake the patient pace of a tiger for the slowness of a turtle, she said. Her words were sharp, structured with the honorifics of a sovereign addressing a lowly subject. You speak of blood and kingdoms, yet you bark in the tongue of a street dog who has found a master's scrap. You stand in a house you did not build, wearing clothes you do not deserve, claiming a city that does not know your name. She stepped forward, her movement so fluid it made the bodyguards flinch. The sun may set on the palace, but the moon still knows who is truly royal. Pick up your paper, commoner. A Valente does not take charity from a thief. The impact was physical. Choi Min-jae's face went pale, his knees buckling in a micro-gesture of ancestral recognition before he could catch himself. The other two bodyguards dropped their heads, their hands falling away from their weapons as if the very sound of her voice had disarmed them. They didn't see a waitress. They heard the authority of 500 years of history. Kang Musuk froze. The ringed hand he had used to mock her was now shaking. The tiger found himself staring at a girl who had just turned his pride into ash with a single sentence. The room didn't just go silent, it turned into a tomb. And for the first time in his life, the most feared man in Seoul realized he was the one who was truly out of his depth. The moment of frozen realization lasted only as long as it took for Li Wang to blink. In that heartbeat, the gravity of what she had done, the shattering of her 3-year masquerade, hit her with the force of a physical blow. She didn't wait for Kang Musuk to find his voice, or for the bodyguards to overcome their instinctive paralysis. She turned and moved, not with the stumbling gait of a waitress, but with the explosive precision of a sprinter. She vanished through the service doors before the first bill of scattered money hit the floor. The transition from the hushed opulence of the Blue Lotus to the humid, neon-drenched chaos of Gangnam's backstreets was a blur of chrome and rain. Wang tore the dark vest from her shoulders, shedding the skin of the servant as she ducked into a narrow alleyway choked with air conditioning units and overflowing trash bins. The rain began to fall in earnest, turning the pavement into a mirror of flickering pink and blue light. Behind her, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed against the brick, calculated, rhythmic, and closing fast. It was Choi Min-jae. He had shaken off the spell of her voice and replaced it with the cold focus of a hunter. Wang didn't head for the main thoroughfares where the crowds and CCTVs were thickest. Those were Musuk's eyes and ears. Instead, she dived deeper into the neon labyrinth, a vertical maze of scaffolding and narrow catwalks that connected the aging tenements hidden behind the skyscrapers. She moved with a frightening familiarity. scaling a rusty fire escape with fingers that didn't slip despite the downpour. She had memorized these routes during her midnight walks, planning for a day she hoped would never come. High above the street, she looked back. Min-jae was there, a shadow in a tailored suit, moving with a terrifying, fluid athleticism. He leapt across a 4-foot gap between rooftops without breaking stride. He wasn't drawing his weapon. He wasn't calling out. He was tracking her like a bloodhound following the scent of a ghost. "You cannot run from the blood, Li Wang," his voice rang out, cutting through the rhythmic hum of the city. It wasn't a threat. It sounded like an admission of a fundamental truth. Wang didn't answer. She swung over a railing, dropping 10 feet onto a corrugated tin roof that groaned under her weight. The impact jarred her teeth, but she rolled into the fall, popping up and sliding down a drainage pipe into a wet market that was just beginning to pack up for the night. She wove through stacks of plastic crates and the smell of crushed ice and fish scales, her white shirt now translucent from the rain, clinging to her skin like a second layer of armor. She was no longer the girl who fumbled. She was a streak of white light cutting through the grime of Seoul. But as she rounded a corner into a dead-end courtyard filled with stacked shipping containers, she skidded to a halt. The exit was blocked by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. She turned, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. Choi Min-jae stepped into the mouth of the alley, blocking her only escape. He stood in the rain, his face unreadable, his suit soaked through. He didn't move to grab her. Instead, he stood at a distance that was both respectful and tactical. "The tiger is coming," Min-jae said, his voice low and urgent. "But he is not the only one. You shouldn't have spoken, princess. Now the world remembers you exist, and there are men who will kill to make sure you're forgotten again." The rain didn't just fall anymore. It lashed against the corrugated metal of the courtyard like 1,000 frantic drums. Choi Min-jae stood perfectly still, his silhouette a dark tear in the neon-blurred curtain of the alley. For a moment, the tension between them was purely historical, the hunter and the ghost, the bodyguard and the secret sovereign. "If you want to kill me, do it," Wang said, her voice steady despite the way her wet clothes weighed her down. "But don't tell me I have nowhere to go. I've been nowhere for 3 years. Min-jae opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. His head snapped toward the entrance of the alley, his hand finally reaching for the weapon concealed at his small of his back. It wasn't the arrival of Kang Moo-sok's main force that had alerted him. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there, the rhythmic, metallic tink-tink-tink of a blade being dragged casually along a chain-link fence. From the shadows emerged a man who looked far too small for the terror he radiated. Oh Tae-shik walked with an unnatural, disjointed grace, wearing a cheap yellow rain slicker that looked garish under the flickering pink neon sign of a nearby love hotel. He wasn't one of Moo-sok's suit-clad professionals. He was the Shadow Hand, a freelancer whose name was whispered in the deepest pits of the Seoul underworld to frighten those who thought they were untouchable. "Min-jae," the small man chirped, his voice high and melodic, almost playful. "The boss is very upset, but Park Sung-ho, he's very excited. He told me that today the tiger dies and the rabbit dies and only the shadow remains." Min-jae's eyes widened. "Sung-ho? That snake! He sent you to hit Moo-sok?" "He sent me to hit everyone," Tae-shik corrected, his smile widening to reveal teeth that looked too sharp in the dark. He flicked his wrist, and a folding karambit knife snapped open with a sound like a clicking bone. "The old man is already being escorted to a more private location. You were supposed to be with him, but you followed the girl. It makes my job so much more efficient." The power dynamic in the alleyway shifted instantly. Min-jae, the elite defender, was no longer the threat. He was a target. The realization hit Wang like a cold wave. The syndicate wasn't just coming for her. They were tearing themselves apart, and she had inadvertently stepped into the center of a coup. Tae-shik moved. He didn't run. He blurred. Min-jae fired a single shot, the roar of the suppressed pistol swallowed by a sudden clap of thunder. Taishik wasn't there. He was a yellow streak against the shipping containers, closing the distance with a speed that defied human biology. Min-jae stepped in front of Wong, his large frame acting as a shield, but Taishik's blade found the gap in his guard, slicing through the fine wool of Min-jae's sleeve and drawing a spray of crimson that turned black in the neon light. "Run!" Min-jae barked at Wong, his voice straining as he grappled with the assassin. "If they take you, the bloodline ends. Go!" Wang watched as the man who had been her hunter moments ago risked his life to hold back a monster. The bodyguards weren't in control anymore. The tiger had been betrayed. As Taishik let out a low, bubbling laugh, Wang realized that her invisibility was gone forever. She could no longer be the girl who fumbled. If she didn't find a way to fight back, the shadow hand would be the last thing she ever saw. The roar of the city above was replaced by the hollow, metallic groan of the subterranean world. Wang and Min-jae scrambled down a maintenance ladder, their boots skidding on slick rungs until they hit the gravel of the transit tunnels. The air here was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust, a stark contrast to the rain-washed streets they had just fled. Min-jae leaned against the damp concrete wall, his breath coming in ragged hitches. His silk sleeve was a sodden mess of black wool and crimson, the wound from Taishik's blade weeping steadily. Wang didn't hesitate. She stepped into his personal space, her movements stripped of their clumsy waitress facade, and tore a strip of fabric from her own white uniform. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice regaining that melodic royal authority. Min-jae looked at her, his dark eyes clouded with pain and a burgeoning respect. "You should have left me back there. Taishik doesn't stop. He's probably already found the access hatch." "A sovereign does not leave their guard behind, even one who serves a usurper," Wang replied, pulling the knot tight around his bicep. Min-jae winced, but the bleeding slowed. The uneasy silence was shattered by a distant, rhythmic clanging. It wasn't the sound of a train, it was the sound of steel against steel. Taishik's karambit dancing along the tunnel pipes. Then came the others, 3 silhouettes in tactical gear, emerging from the darkness of the northbound tunnel. Park Sung-ho hadn't just sent an assassin, he had sent a cleaning crew. "Behind the transformer," Min-jae hissed, drawing his backup piece, a compact Glock. Wang didn't have a weapon, but she had the geography of the dark. She moved like a shadow through the iron pillars, her white shirt a ghost in the gloom. As the first gunmen approached their position, Min-jae provided the distraction, a double tap that echoed like thunder in the confined space, forcing the men to dive for cover. In that heartbeat of chaos, Wang acted. She grabbed a heavy, discarded iron crowbar from a tool rack and swung with a precision that suggested her slow movements in the lounge had been a masterclass in suppressed kinetic energy. The bar connected with the lead mercenary's knee, a sickening crack following the impact. As he went down, Wang didn't freeze. She pivoted, using the man's momentum to pull him into the path of his comrade's fire. "The third rail!" Min-jae shouted, his voice straining. "Move to the maintenance alcove." They moved in a desperate, synchronized dance. Min-jae covered their retreat with disciplined fire, while Wang led them through a maze of high-voltage signs and dripping pipes she had memorized from the city's blueprints. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting as a single unit. The Mafia's shield and the royal ghost bound by the shared blood on the tracks. As a subway train screamed past on the adjacent line, the wind nearly knocking them off their feet, Wang looked back. Through the flickering sparks and the blur of the passing cars, she saw Taishik standing on the opposite platform, his yellow slicker a splash of poison in the dark. He wasn't attacking yet. He was watching. A predator, realizing that the rabbit he had been chasing had suddenly grown claws. Wang turned back to the darkness of the tunnel, pulling Min-jae with her. The alliance was forged in iron and ozone, and as they vanished into the depths of the city's veins, the message was clear. The hunt was far from over, but the prey had stopped running. The damp, metallic air of the transit tunnels gave way to a hidden staircase that rose into the heart of a forgotten district. They emerged not into the glass and steel glare of modern Seoul, but into a pocket of the city where time had stalled. Tucked between two towering skyscrapers stood a hide-walled enclosure, a traditional hanok whose curved tile roofs reached toward the rainy sky like the wings of a resting bird. Wang led the wounded Min-jae through the heavy timber gate into the central courtyard. Here, the frantic noise of the city became a muffled hum. The ground was paved with smooth river stones that glistened in the dark, and the scent of damp pine and old paper replaced the city's ozone. "Where are we?" Min-jae whispered, his face pale as he leaned against a pillar of weathered wood. This wasn't a safe house or a tactical bunker. It was a sanctuary. "The home of my ancestors," Wang replied, her voice soft but echoing with the weight of the architecture. She helped him onto the polished wooden veranda, the daichang, and disappeared into the shadows of a sliding paper door. She returned moments later with a traditional lacquer chest filled with medicinal herbs and clean white cloth. As she worked to properly dress his wound, the moonlight filtered through the clouds, illuminating the intricate carvings on the ceiling beams, dragons and phoenixes that had watched over her family for centuries. Min-jae looked around, his eyes widening as he recognized the specific crests etched into the stone foundation. "The House of Yi!" he breathed, the realization hitting him harder than the assassin's blade. "You aren't just a descendant. You are the direct line, the shadow the syndicate was told to bury 40 years ago." Wang tied the bandage with a sharp, final tug. She stood and walked to the center of the courtyard, the rain dripping from the eaves in a rhythmic curtain around her. "My father died so I could be a waitress," she said, her back to him. "He told me that a name is a heavy thing to carry in a world that only values power. But tonight, Kang Musak reminded me that when you hide from your name, you give your power to the vultures." She turned to look at him, her silhouette framed by the ancient wood. "I am Li Wang. My great-grandfather sat on the throne of this city before the concrete was poured, and I am tired of fumbling in the dark." Min-jae struggled to his feet, his hand instinctively moving to his chest in a gesture of respect he hadn't shown even to Musak. In the quiet of the hanok, the waitress had truly vanished. In the silver light, he didn't see a girl in a stained uniform. He saw the steel of a royal house that had refused to break. "The syndicate thinks you're a loose end," Min-jae said, his voice low and solemn. "But they don't know they've walked into a palace. Park Sung-ho is coming for the tiger's head, but he has no idea who is actually holding the sword." Wang looked at a small, silk-wrapped box resting on a pedestal in the main hall. It was the only thing she had left of her father's legacy. "Then let them come," she said. "If they want to finish the war they started, I will show them how a queen defends her home." The stillness of the hanok was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots on stone. Park Sung-ho did not wait for an invitation. He stepped onto the wooden veranda, flanked by Oh Tae-shik, and a squad of men whose suppressed rifles gleamed like wet ink in the moonlight. Behind them, dragged by his collar, was bloodied and disoriented Kang Musak. The tiger of Seoul looked declawed, his pride leaking out onto the ancient floorboards. "A palace hidden in a slum," Sung-ho mused, his voice smooth and devoid of the loyalty he had mimicked for years. He looked at the bruised Min-jae, then turned his gaze to Li Wang. She stood at the far end of the hall, her white shirt stained with grime, yet she remained as unmoving as a statue in a shrine. "I came for a waitress and I find a museum. It's a shame, really. History is so much harder to clean up than blood." "You have already spilled enough today, commoner," Wang said. Her voice didn't shake. It carried the cold, resonant authority of the court dialect, vibrating through the wooden pillars. Taeshik stepped forward, the karambit in his hand dancing a silver arc, but Sung-ho raised a hand to stop him. He was staring at what lay on the pedestal beside Wong, the silk-wrapped lacquer box. "The legend of the seal of state," Sung-ho whispered, a greedy light igniting in his eyes. "The syndicate spent 40 years looking for the leverage your father took to his grave, the codes to the old offshore accounts, the names of the families who funded the transition. Give me the box, and I might let you live as a ghost for another 3 years." Wong let her hand rest on the lid of the box. She looked at Kang Moo-sok, who was watching her with wide-eyed shock, realizing that the slow girl was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. "You think this is about money?" Wong asked, her lip curling in a regal sneer. "This box contains the names of every man who betrayed the throne to build your syndicate. It contains the signatures of the grandfathers of the men you serve. If I open this, the world doesn't just see a coup. They see that your entire empire is built on the bones of a theft. You won't be a boss, Sung-ho. You'll be a target for every family in Asia." "Give it to me," Sung-ho barked, his composure slipping. He gestured for his men to level their rifles. Wong gripped the box. "Then come and take it. But know this, once the seal is broken, the silence is over. There is no going back to the shadows." For a heartbeat, the air was a physical weight. Sung-ho's greed warred with his survival instinct. He looked at the box, convinced that the thin wood held the nuclear option of the underworld. In that moment of hesitation, his focus broke. He didn't see Min-jae shifting his weight. He didn't see the silent communication between the bodyguard and the waitress. Wong threw the box. She didn't hand it over, she hurled it into the darkness of the courtyard. As Sung-ho and Tae-shik instinctively lunged for the falling prize, the diversion was complete. Min-jae exploded into motion, tackling the nearest gunman, while Wong dove for the floor as the first frantic shots splintered the ancient wood above her head. The bluff had worked. The royal box hit the stones with a hollow, empty thud. But by then, the tiger had already begun to bite back. The empty silk box tumbled through the moonlight, its lacquer surface catching a glint of neon before it struck the stone tiles with a hollow, mocking clatter. For Park Sung-ho, that sound was the tolling of his own funeral bell. The split second he spent tracking the flight of the seal was the only opening the tiger needed. Despite his wounds, Kang Moo-sok moved with the explosive ferocity that had built his empire. He lunged from the ground, grabbing the discarded karambit from the chaos and driving it upward. In the same breath, Min-jae disarmed the lead gunman with a bone-shattering kick, turning the tactical rifle against the remaining mercenaries. The Hanok, once a sanctuary of silence, erupted into a frantic, close-quarters symphony of steel and gunpowder. Lee Wong did not hide. She stood at the center of the storm, the royal ghost presiding over the carnage. When Park Sung-ho scrambled toward her, his face twisted in a mask of desperate greed, she didn't flinch. She met her rush with a single, fluid strike with the heavy pedestal, a movement born of years of suppressed rage. He collapsed at her feet, his dreams of a coup dying on the ancient floorboards of a family he had tried to erase. As the last of the mercenaries fled into the rainy night, a heavy, absolute silence returned to the courtyard. Tae-shik had vanished into the shadows, a predator recognizing a failed hunt, leaving Park Sung-ho groaning in the dirt. Kang Moo-sok stood over his traitorous second-in-command, breathing heavily, his black suit shredded and stained. He looked at the empty box lying open on the stones, revealing nothing but a yellowed piece of hanji paper with a single, handwritten poem. Moo-sok turned his gaze to Lee Wang. For the first time, the Mafia king truly saw her. He didn't see a clumsy waitress or a girl who fumbled the tea. He saw the lineage that had survived the fires of history. He walked toward her, his gait slow and pained, and stopped a respectful 3 paces away. Slowly, with the stiffness of a man acknowledging a power greater than his own, he bowed. Not the shallow nod of a boss to a subordinate, but the deep, formal bow of a subject to a sovereign. The seal was a lie, Musuk rasped, his voice holding a new, jagged edge of respect. The seal is a piece of stone, Wang replied, her voice ringing with the cold clarity of the court dialect. The power is in the blood that remembers. You have your syndicate, Kang Musuk, but you sit on a throne of glass. Do not forget who owns the ground beneath it. Musuk nodded once, a silent pact sealed in the blood-slicked courtyard. He would clean up the mess of the coup. He would bury the names of those who had betrayed them. In exchange, the waitress would return to the shadows, a hidden queen keeping watch over a city that would never know her name. Min Jae stepped to her side, his hand resting on his chest in a final salute. As the first light of dawn began to gray the sky over Gangnam, Li Wang turned back toward the inner sanctum of the Hanok. The masquerade would continue, and she would return to the lounge, perhaps dropping a tray or spilling a drink, but the tiger now knew the truth. The slow girl wasn't hiding from the world, she was merely allowing it to exist. The reign of the shadows had begun. The chaos of the night had left the Hanok scarred, splintered wood and spent shells marring the ancient grain of the veranda, but as the sun began to bleed over the Gangnam skyline, a different kind of clarity took hold. Standing amidst the ruins of the coup, Li Wang looked at her hands. They were no longer trembling. The slow waitress had disappeared, replaced by a woman who understood that her true heritage wasn't just a burden to hide, but a source of unshakable strength. The story of the royal waitress and the Mafia king carries a profound moral lesson. True power does not lie in the volume of one's voice, but in the depth of one's character and the timing of one's truth. For years, Li Wang believed that survival required her to be lesser, to fumble, to fail, and to shrink herself to fit into the shadows of men who valued only speed and aggression. She mistook silence for weakness. However, the night proved that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting the loudest or flashing the most gold. It is the one who knows exactly who they are and waits for the right moment to speak. Kang Musuk learned a lesson in humility that no street war could ever teach him. He realized that the people we overlook, the invisible, the slow, and the clumsy, often carry weights and histories we cannot fathom. To underestimate someone based on their position is the greatest mistake a leader can make. Beneath every humble uniform, there may be a heart of a king or the soul of a queen. Ultimately, the story teaches us that dignity is a choice. We can be stripped of our titles, our wealth, and our homes, but our lineage, the values and the spirit passed down through generations, is a fortress that no enemy can breach. Li Wang returned to her life not as a victim hiding from the past, but as a sovereign in disguise, proving that you don't need a crown to be royal. You only need the courage to stand tall when the world demands you bow. The tiger now walks with caution, and the rabbit no longer fears the woods, because in the heart of Seoul, they both finally understand. The loudest bark belongs to the dog, but the silent gaze belongs to the master. If you enjoyed the story of betrayal, romance, and Sicilian justice, we invite you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and enable notifications to stay updated on future stories.